On the morning of the 27th of August, 2022, a team of marine biologists from the Environment Agency Abu Dhabi waded into the shallow waters off the western fringe of Palm Jumeirah and recorded something that no promotional brochure had ever prepared them for. The coral transplant sites they had seeded 2 years earlier, a modest attempt to restore life to the seabed that the island's construction had smothered, were largely dead. The water temperature that morning was 35 degrees Celsius. The fish were gone. The sediment, disturbed by a decade and a half of dredging, piling, and reclamation, had settled into a fine gray paste that choked whatever managed to survive. Standing knee-deep in what was once a thriving coastal ecosystem, one researcher described the water as biologically silent. That phrase, quiet as it is, contains the entire story of Palm Jumeirah. The island did not drown quietly or suddenly. It drowned the way most expensive mistakes do, slowly, incrementally, and in full public view, while everyone involved kept insisting that things were going according to plan. Palm Jumeirah was conceived in the late 1990s by Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum as the physical embodiment of a single ambition: to transform Dubai from a regional trading post into a global destination. The emirate had oil, but its reserves were always modest compared to Abu Dhabi's, and the leadership understood earlier than most that the oil would not last. Tourism, real estate, and finance would have to carry the weight. The problem was that Dubai's natural coastline was roughly 70 kilometers long, not enough to sustain the luxury property market that Sheikh Mohammed envisioned. The solution, conceived with the Dutch engineering firm Boskalis and executed by Nakheel Properties, was to build more coastline from scratch. Not a pier, not a marina, an entire palm-shaped island, roughly 5 kilometers in diameter, constructed from 100 million cubic meters of dredged sand and 7 million tons of rock, stretching into the Arabian Gulf. When completed, it would add 78 kilometers of new beachfront to Dubai. The estimated cost was $5 billion. The estimated timeline was 3 years. Neither figure held. Nakheel began dredging in 2001. The scale of the operation was genuinely unprecedented. 14 suction dredgers worked around the clock, pulling sand from the seabed of the Gulf and spraying it into the shape of a palm frond, each movement guided by GPS coordinates, accurate to within a few centimeters. Photographs taken from the International Space Station in 2003 showed the palm's outline visible from orbit, a fact Nakheel's marketing department repeated so often it became almost meaningless. But the images were striking, and they did their job. Off-plan apartments in the fronds sold within hours of release. Celebrities bought villas on the trunk. David Beckham purchased a property. Rod Stewart purchased a property. The waiting list for the Atlantis Resort, which would anchor the crescent at the island's top, stretched into the hundreds. By 2006, Bloomberg was reporting that Palm Jumeirah had generated more than $14 billion in real estate transactions before a single resident had moved in. The engineering problems began almost immediately, though they were not discussed publicly for years. The island was built on sand, literally hydraulically placed sand that had not been compacted, tested for load-bearing capacity in the traditional sense, or given sufficient time to settle before construction began. A 2006 study published in the journal Géotechnique, co-authored by researchers at Imperial College London, raised concerns about liquefaction risk, the phenomenon by which saturated, loosely packed sand loses its structural integrity during seismic activity and behaves more like a liquid than a solid. The Arabian Gulf is not a high seismic zone, but it is not inert either. The researchers noted that the compaction methods used on the Palm, while innovative, had not been independently verified against long-term settlement modeling. Nakheel disputed the findings. The construction continued. By 2008, residents who had moved into the frond villas were noticing cracks in their walls. Some reported floors that were no longer level. Independent surveyors hired by homeowners found evidence of differential settlement, meaning different parts of the same structure were sinking at different rates, a classic symptom of the underlying soil not having consolidated evenly. Nakheel acknowledged some subsidence but characterized it as within acceptable engineering tolerances. The global financial crisis hit Dubai later that year, and the property market collapsed. Nakheel itself had to be bailed out by the Abu Dhabi government in 2009 after accumulating debts of approximately $26 billion. The Palm's problems, physical and financial, were suddenly very difficult to separate from each other. The environmental damage was, in some respects, the most irreversible consequence of the entire project. Before construction began, the seabed around the Palm's footprint supported seagrass meadows and shallow reef systems that served as nursery habitat for a significant portion of the Gulf's inshore fish population. A 2008 environmental impact assessment commissioned by the Dubai government and subsequently obtained and published in part by the environmental group Friends of the Gulf found that the construction had destroyed approximately 8 square kilometers of productive seabed habitat. Water circulation along the coast had been fundamentally altered by the island's bulk. The crescent breakwater that surrounds the Palm was intended to protect the inner lagoon from wave action, but it also trapped sediment and warmer water, reducing the tidal flushing that kept the lagoon biologically active. By 2010, water quality monitoring stations inside the crescent were recording oxygen levels low enough to be classified as hypoxic, the technical term for water that cannot adequately support marine life. The lagoon, in ecological terms, was dying. The residents were not dying, but many were leaving. By 2012, vacancy rates in some frond segments were running above 40%, according to property data compiled by Jones Lang LaSalle. The island had been marketed as one of the most exclusive addresses on Earth, but exclusivity requires more than a unique shape visible from space. It requires functional infrastructure, roads that do not flood, a monorail that runs reliably, beaches that are clean enough to swim from. The Palm's monorail, opened in 2009, connected only the trunk to the Atlantis Hotel, leaving the outer fronds dependent on a single feeder road that became notorious for gridlock. The beaches, those 78 kilometers of new coastline that had justified the entire project, were frequently closed due to bacterial contamination from the lagoon's poor water circulation. A 2014 report by the Dubai municipality found elevated levels of fecal coliform bacteria at multiple beach sites along the inner crescent levels that exceeded the World Health Organization's guidelines for safe, recreational bathing. Nakheel responded with remediation efforts over the following years. Additional water circulation pumps were installed. Dredging operations periodically cleared accumulated sediment. A coral transplantation program, partially funded by a partnership with the World Wildlife Fund, was announced in 2020 with genuine ambition, placing coral fragments on artificial reef structures attached to the breakwater's base. The biologists who visited in August 2022 were there to assess that program. Their findings were not published in a press release. The property market, meanwhile, performed its own strange recovery. Dubai's real estate sector surged after 2020, driven by an influx of wealthy expatriates from Russia following the sanctions imposed after the invasion of Ukraine, and by a parallel wave of buyers from Europe and South Asia seeking assets in a low-tax jurisdiction. According to a Knight Frank report from 2023, Palm Jumeirah recorded some of the highest per-square-meter transaction prices in Dubai's history during that period. A penthouse in the One Palm Tower sold for approximately $82 million, a figure that circulated widely in the financial press. On the surface, the numbers suggested that the island had vindicated itself, that the vision of Sheikh Mohammed had ultimately proved correct, and that the environmental and structural controversies were footnotes rather than headlines. That interpretation requires some scrutiny. The price surge on the Palm was concentrated almost entirely in a handful of premium tower developments on the trunk buildings constructed more recently, on better consolidated ground, with modern infrastructure independent of the island's original design. The frond villas, the original product, the homes that had been sold in the early 2000s as the defining luxury residential offering of the 21st century, told a different story. Many remained stubbornly below their original launch prices in inflation-adjusted terms, according to transaction data reviewed by Reuters in 2023. The structural issues had not been resolved so much as absorbed into the discount buyers expected when purchasing in those sections. The island had bifurcated into two real estate markets wearing the same address. The deeper irony is architectural and almost philosophical. The palm was designed to be seen. Its meaning was visual, the palm shape, the scale, the audacity. It was an act of nation branding performed in sand and rock, intended to signal that Dubai could do what no other city had done. In that narrow sense, it succeeded completely. The images are everywhere. The island is recognizable to people who have never visited the Gulf, who could not locate Dubai on a map with confidence, who have no interest in property markets or marine ecology. It achieved the celebrity it sought. The problem is that the celebrity was always the product, and the island was the advertisement. The people who bought villas in the fronds discovered, incrementally, that they had purchased a billboard. There is also the question of what comes next, which is not a comfortable question to ask about a $5 billion island. The settlement is ongoing, not catastrophic, but continuous. The environmental degradation inside the crescent is structural, tied to the island's geometry, and cannot be fully corrected without alterations to the breakwater that would cost hundreds of millions of dollars and would themselves disrupt the marine environment further. The Coral Restoration Program, as the 2022 survey indicated, is operating against a baseline of water temperatures that are rising with the Gulf's broader warming trend. The Arabian Gulf is one of the fastest warming bodies of water on Earth, according to a 2021 study published in Ocean Science, and the thermal stress that killed the transplanted corals in the summer of 2022 will not diminish as the decades pass. Dubai is already building the next version of itself, as it always has. Palm Jebel Ali, abandoned after the financial crisis, is being revived. The Dubai 2040 Urban Master Plan envisions a city of 5.5 million people, with new development corridors extending into the desert and along the coast. The energy is genuine and the capital is real. But Palm Jumeirah sits there in the Gulf, still photogenic, still expensive in the right postcodes, still functioning as the image Dubai exports to the world, and it contains a set of questions that the city has never fully answered. What does it mean to build something permanent from something inherently temporary? What do you owe the ecosystem you displace? What happens when the spectacle outlasts the substance? The marine biologist who described the water as biologically silent that August morning was not making a political statement. She was recording an observation. The instruments she was using do not distinguish between ambition and negligence, between vision and recklessness. They simply measure what is present and what is absent. In the shallows off Palm Jumeirah, on a morning that was already unbearably hot before 9 o'clock, what was absent was life. That is not the end of the island's story, but it is, perhaps, the part of the story that will be hardest to revise.